This happened to me over the course of a month, and even now when I hear tires crunching on gravel, I feel that old cold in my chest. I live at the edge of a suburb that bleeds into a tangle of old logging trails and second-growth forest, the kind of place where the sky goes dark early and the only lights you see are the glow of houses far off the ridge. I rode those trails 3 or 4 times a week, usually alone, usually at dusk, because the air there quieted my head and the single track let me think. One evening on a humid, late summer night, I left later than planned. The air smelled like earth and resin, and incoming clouds made the entire tree line look like a black ocean. About 15 minutes into a downhill stretch, I heard a voice call my name from the trees, clear and close, as if someone stood on the path behind me. It was not a shout or the usual laugh of another rider. It was soft and oddly patient. "You can help me," it said. My body reacted before my brain. I stopped hard, my front wheel throwing pebbles, and turned my light into the dark. For a moment there was nothing but the white cone of the beam and a line of glistening leaves. Then, at the edge of the light, a small figure stood, half-turned, hands in pockets, face hidden under a cap. I felt my heart press against my ribs like a hand. That night was only the first of 4 encounters, and none of them behaved in a way that made sense. I was not an expert in survival or tracking. I grew up in a neighborhood with lawns and barbecues, and a dad who fixed cars, and a mom who taught 3rd grade. My name is Alex, and I had always used riding as a way to manage anxiety. I met Mark in high school, and we kept riding together on weekends when schedules allowed. Later, when my sister Sarah moved back to town, she warned me about isolated trails, but never rode with me. My friend Jesse introduced me to some of the deeper single track, and Tom lent me a set of lights when I misjudged daylight last winter. I have an old dog named Cooper who sleeps at the foot of my bed, and a neighbor Erin who waves as she waters her lawn in the morning. Those people mattered because after the first night, I called Mark, I messaged Sarah, I told Jesse, and their reactions became a record of what I thought I was feeling. The backstory is simple. I rode to clear my head. I trusted my routes. I liked the predictable strains of climbing and the reward of the descent. I liked being alone enough to think, but not so isolated that I was careless. That pattern is what the thing in the woods interrupted. It forced me to remeasure what alone meant, and what a familiar route could hide. The first incident had an oddness to it that was not immediately terrifying. After I left the light on the path and waited, the figure did not step forward. I called out, "Who is there? Are you okay?" A pause, a rustle like someone easing a pack, and then, "I'm sorry, I thought this was the way back." The voice was small. I asked if they were lost. They replied, "Yes." I asked if they needed water. Their answer was, "No, just looked like you knew the trail." The conversation could have been over in a minute. Instead, it stretched. "Are you alone?" they asked. "Yes," I said, tightening my grip on the handlebars. The person said, "That's how I like it too." "Are you leaving now?" I asked, and the answer was, pause, then, "Take care." The exchanges were brief, but layered with an odd calm that felt rehearsed. I rode off slowly, my light cutting a path and leaving the figure in the shadow of birch trunks. I called Mark as soon as I hit the road in town. He answered on the second ring. I told him what had happened. He laughed at first. He said, "Go home, lock up, get a beer." He said, "Maybe someone messed with you." But he agreed to meet me for a ride later that week. That small misunderstanding should have been the end of it, but it did not remain confined to one night or one voice. Over the next few rides, the sense of being watched crept in like fog. I began to notice things that did not fit with the usual trail life. A single shoe left on the side of a logging road without a sock. Fresh small footprints that faded into leaf litter as if they had been erased. My water bottle, which I always clipped to my frame at the same place, found one morning a little further back on the seat, damp in a way that suggested it had been out in the mist. Once, near a creek crossing, I found a string of small stones arranged in a line pointing toward the bank. On my phone, the tracking app showed a slight detour in distance that I could not remember taking. Each of these details was trivial on its own, but together they formed a pattern that made my chest tighten. I mentioned the shoe to Erin when she was trimming the hedge. She frowned, said that was strange, and told me to ask Ranger Mike at the park office. I left him a message. Ranger Mike called back midday. He sounded patient. He asked for dates and times. He told me to alert the rangers if I saw anything else. Officer Ramirez from the county station was the one who eventually came out after my request. He said, "We will do a drive-through tomorrow night." He said, "Keep any evidence if you find it, and do not confront anyone." He said, "Did you get footage?" I said no. He said, "Try to bring a friend." He said, "We will patrol." His voice was flat and official and helpful in the way of someone who had heard many versions of Night People. At the 1/3 mark in this story, I need to ask you something that matters. If you were in my shoes, would you do one of three things? 1. Step off the trail and call the police immediately. 2. Try to approach carefully and communicate to see if someone needs help. Or 3. Gather proof from a distance with your phone and wait for backup. If you want, leave your number choice in the comments with a short note about why you picked it. If you have ridden alone in the woods and felt watched, tell us what you did and what you wish you had done differently. Real stories help other people decide how to act when a small oddity might mean danger or might mean someone in crisis. Your comment could be the reason another rider chooses caution over curiosity. I read everything. I am not asking for sympathy here, I am asking for perspective. Now, back to what happened after I posted that message to Mark and to a local riders group. The second encounter made it clear that this was not about a lost hiker. A week after the first voice, I was mid-ride with Mark and Jesse when we came to a clearing I call the bowl because the trees open and the moon spills like water. Mark went ahead to film a line. Jesse was adjusting her saddle. I pedaled up slowly and heard someone whistle a familiar tune, the kind of half melody a person whistles when they ride by themselves for hours. I called out, "Hey, who is that?" No answer at first. Then a voice said, "Over here." We turned the lights, and in the middle of the bowl, someone stood beneath a peeling signpost that marks a private boundary. It was a man wearing a coat, despite the heat, and he had a notebook in hand. He said, "You folks ride often." Mark asked what he wanted. The man said, "I am mapping the trails. I like to keep track." Jessie felt uneasy. She said, "Why are you out here at night?" The man said, "I like the quiet." I spoke and asked if he needed help. He looked at my handlebars, then back at us and said, "No, just watching the road." There were 5 short exchanges, each one packed with small defeats of explanation. Then he smiled with teeth that did not match his weathered face and walked back into the tree line. We followed the tracks for a while and found a tarp and a small pile of food wrappers, but no sign of where he had vanished. That night, we all felt watched in a way that changed our post-ride conversation from gossip to strategy. I called Officer Ramirez the next morning and left a message about the man in the coat. I also told Ranger Mike. Ramirez called me back and asked for a photo, or better yet, a sketch. I said I had none, but could describe him. Ramirez said, "We will try to send a unit through on the weekend." I texted Sarah and asked her to keep the dog if I went alone on a late ride. She replied with an eye-rolling emoji and said, "Be sensible." Around then, Tom texted a blurry photo he said he had taken from his phone that matched the man we saw. He included a timestamp from 2 nights earlier. When I zoomed in, I could not make out a face, but there was the same coat and the same slouched posture. These are the names that populate the story: Mark, Jesse, Tom, Sarah, Ranger Mike, Officer Ramirez, Erin, Dad. They are not extras. They are the people who heard me breathe on the phone, who helped search, who doubted, and who believed. The third incident was smaller, but it narrowed my options. My bike was in my garage the morning after a rainy ride, and I found a scrap of cloth tied to the brake lever. It was stained and smelled faintly of smoke and pine. I called Mark, and he came over within the hour. He crouched close to the bike and said, "That is deliberate." He said that if someone wanted to send a message, they would not leave it inside the garage where someone could find it at leisure. He said, "This is to remind you." Jesse suggested we set up a small camera on the trailhead. I bought a cheap motion camera and tacked it to a low branch with a zip tie. We left it for 2 nights and pulled the footage with anticipation. The videos had long blank segments and then a grainy shadow that approached the frame and receded without showing a face. Each clip ended with a single clear sound, like someone moving a shoelace against bark. The grainy shadow moved in ways that did not match a normal gait. It paused where no pause was natural. We debated whether it was someone playing games. Ranger Mike told me to drop the footage at the office and he would compare it to other reports. Officer Ramirez came by and took a copy. He kept his tone steady and said, "We will keep an eye on it, but people do weird things." He also said, "If you feel threatened, call 911. I started carrying a small pocket knife in my jersey and practicing quick calls on the numbered speed dial. The sensation of being hunted moved from intellectual worry to a muscle memory that triggered when a twig snapped behind me. One night, 2 weeks in, the fourth and most intense encounter happened, and it forced the decision I still replay in my head. We had left the motion camera out again, and the 3 of us rode to check it before dawn. It was still dark when we broke trail, and the underbrush held mist like a net. My breathing fogged in my light, and every wheel came through the wet leaves with a soft crush. 10 minutes from the camera, we found fresh tracks running parallel to ours, close enough that if you reached out, you could have touched the prints. They were narrow, as if from a mountain bike tire, and they had a faint smear of mud on the right side, as if someone had braked hard. The first tension surge came when Mark said, "There it is," and pointed with his handlebar. The camera was on the ground, and a long thread of cable lay cut beside it. The description must be precise, because these moments are the anchor of the story. In silence, we followed the tracks deeper. Then a voice called, "I did not mean to frighten you," from behind a stand of cedars. We all froze. The exchange that followed was 5 short lines that rose in pressure. I said, "Who are you?" The voice said, "A friend." Jesse said, "What do you want?" The voice said, "To ride with you." Mark said, "You cannot just take cameras." The voice said, "I only wanted to see." Each line shortened our distance like a tightening rope. Suddenly, a figure stepped out, holding a light low to the ground. The light was wrong. It hit the trees at an odd angle, and the person moved with a limp that made the approach seem planned and slow. I remember the smell of damp cloth and the metallic tinge of adrenaline. The man raised his hands as if to show he had nothing more than curiosity. I had my phone out. I debated the choice between calling and confronting. I chose to back away and tell him to leave. He smiled and said, "I will see you again." He melted into the trees and left us with the echo of his footfalls. That night, the choice to retreat became a source of shame and a source of survival. The climactic sequences that followed are hard to compress, but must be detailed because they changed everything. In the first expended moment of tension, I chased a shadow after a late ride with Tom. We heard a snapping branch, and then the unmistakable clatter of a bike chain catching rocks. Tom shouted, "Did you hear that?" And I shouted, "Yes." And suddenly a boom of footsteps came from 3 directions at once. The undergrowth moved. I felt the heat of my own breath like a drum. A figure stepped into the path with a headlamp too bright to bear, and a voice that said, "Stop screaming like that." The man was smaller than Mark. I expected and wore a scarf pulled tightly across his face. He asked, "Why are you following?" I said, "We are not following." He said, "Then why are you here?" Tom said, "We ride here." And the man said, "You are on my route." The argument was a rope with no end. My hands shook so hard I could barely get out the number for Ranger Dispatch. The man lunged and then pulled back, and we left. The internal debate in that moment lasted in a continuous loop for days. Was it safer to run, to fight, to hold position and call for help? The memory of the lamp sweeping across wet leaves and the man breathing heavy like an animal is something I still relive. The second extended moment came 2 nights later when I set a plan with Officer Ramirez and Ranger Mike. We rode out with 2 patrol cars waiting at an access point and cameras in hand. We meant to catch whoever had been following us. The tension unfolded slowly, then snapped. In one instant, a flashlight beam hit the trees, and a person moved fast enough that my brain could not parse motion into legs. The radio squawked and voices overlapped. Officer Ramirez said, "Hold your position." Ranger Mike said, "Stay on the line." I felt the ground tremble as someone ran through the underbrush like a herd. Then there was a long and terrible quiet. We found a line of hanging cloth tied to saplings like a string of flags leading away from the trail. The flags were soaked and smelled like old smoke. There were no footprints heading out, and the cloth was tied at a height that no child could reach. The impossibility of the arrangement is what made me stop. That night, the officials said they would increase patrols. They said the evidence did not show how someone could appear and disappear like that without leaving more consistent signs. They asked me again for any footage. I handed over every clip. The result was a report, a promise of follow-ups, and a quiet that was not relief but an uneasy truce. Since those nights, my life narrowed in ways that I had not anticipated. I started running in daylight only. I told Sarah to keep Cooper inside after dusk. I installed additional lights around my yard and a simple alarm on the gate. Mark and Jesse still ride, but they travel as a group now, and they ride further away from the bowl. Tom moved his rides to the west side of town. Ranger Mike sent occasional patrols, and Officer Ramirez called to check in during the first month. He said, "If you see anything, call immediately," and he added, "We are documenting." The documentation is both comforting and hollow. It shows that systems tried to respond and that there was a trail of evidence that they logged. It does not explain the way the figure moved without leaving normal traces, nor does it account for the cloth and the cut cameras. I still find small things shifted in my garage sometimes. I still wake at night thinking a bike wheel is outside my window. I have moments of anger at myself for not confronting more forcefully, at the officials for not finding more, and at the unknown person for making the trails feel hostile. I have learned to trust my instincts more than my curiosity. That lesson sits with me most clearly when I wheel my bike into the back of my car on a clear afternoon and choose a road with people around instead of a quiet ribbon of trees. What I cannot close is whether the thing in the woods was a person with a troubling obsession, someone who wanted to be seen, or something that used the patterns of people to make a private drama. The evidence can be read in multiple ways, and my friends and family have their own theories. Aaron thinks it was a prank that went on too long. Dad thinks someone was camping and watching the trail and got used to our schedules. Sarah worries that it was someone who would escalate. Mark says we are lucky nothing worse happened. Ranger Mike says we will keep patrols and warned me to avoid late solo rides. Officer Ramirez told me to keep records and to encourage other riders to report. I take solace in the small network of names and voices that responded because it turns fear into stories that can be shared, compared, and from which patterns can emerge. I do not have a neat ending to this. The tracking stopped as suddenly as it started for a while, and then there were small return episodes months later, little reminders that the woods remember. I am careful now. I wear a bright jacket and carry extra battery packs and a personal alarm that emits a shrieking tone if I press it. I learn to ride with presence and with people, and sometimes that feels like a slow surrender of solo freedom that I loved. If this story helps one person pause before they step into a dark trail alone, then writing it was worth it. If you have ideas, if you know someone in the county who maps odd patterns on trails, or if you have seen anything similar, please tell me in the comments. I will read every message. I will follow leads. I will check the places you point to, because the only thing that worked when this started was community and attention. Subscribe if you want to hear updates on what we find and what the Rangers report. Stay careful out there and trust your instincts when the woods feel too interested in you.